I'm Eric Whiting from Christie's, and I want to thank all of you, given all the distractions of this museum and the weather outside, that you've come back for our second half this afternoon. At Christie's, we're grateful to have been given the opportunity to help sponsor today's event. I've had the good fortune to have known Alice for about 15 years, going back to when she first suggested the idea of building a museum. I was instantly enthused, of course, because no one had built an American museum dedicated solely to American art since the Amon Carter opened in 1961. There's a 50-year gap, which Alice has filled with this institution. I also had the pleasure of running around this property when it was unimproved in ATVs down dirt tracks, and I'm looking at these stands of trees and spice bush and wild rose, thinking, I've not seen it yet, but it's somewhere in this thicket of woods is going to be a pretty dramatic new museum. And as some of you may know, once this idea was hatched, Alice started traveling all over the country to see museums that have been built since World War II, making lists of things she liked and saw that seemed to be successful, making lists of some things she didn't like and maybe were less successful. And a lot of that hard work, it came to create this great institution. The other reason I was particularly enthused is, as much as we love the Met in New York and the National Gallery in Washington, most people visit those institutions once or twice in their lifetimes. I'm in agreement with my friend and the late Michael Kamen, a professor at Cornell of American culture, who's argued that, the Met, the National Gallery, the museums in London and Paris are all very nice and important, but a lot of the cultural lifting actually happens in the regions with institutions like this, which reach out to people all the time, not just on occasional trips to big cities. And I have to say, I'm a professional symposium attender, I'm a professional exhibition opening attender, I'm an expert in Chardonnays, and this institution does things very well, very professionally. For those of you who've gone online and looked at all the activities that this institution provides, it is impressive. No one person could possibly do them all. And that's a real credit, and it shows in the success. I'm told there are north of 600,000 people coming through here every year. I grew up in the Northeast. I went to college in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and we've got a nice little museum there called the Clark Art Institute. And Alice and I early on talked about the Clark as being a model to look at, and she got to know Michael Conforti, the director there, very well. It's a couple of hours from a couple of metropolitan areas, Boston and New York, maybe here Kansas City and Tulsa, and it was promoting high-quality programs with success. Well, Alice, as I said, is doing 600,000. The Clark is doing about 200,000. So here's to the success of Crystal Bridges. And I got a premature thank you because we got a lot of programming, but thanks to all of you for attending. And now we're going to start our afternoon program. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Just so quiet. So I'm really excited to get into this next panel around identity and the mythology of the melting pot. So when I read this subject, I had a few things, many thoughts and feelings about it. And it's a lot of what I talk about and live through on a pretty regular basis. So I was like, yeah, I'm in. And I think that we discover, as much as America's been referred to as a melting pot, we know that it's much more of a mosaic. And I think that the poems will tell you the rest. So this is a series on that subject. Imitation of Hope, 2008. Why do they call him black when he's half white? She asks me at work. And she is my boss, and I like her, and am still the only black person she knows, or half white, as she demands to assert casually, as if I still would have gotten the job if I had come to the interview with my afro screaming and dancing and not strangled into a stifled bun, as if I can leave half of myself waiting at the door, reaching for mythical bootstraps, as if I didn't replace 2 people when they hired me, as if they didn't replace me with 3 when I left, as if we don't literally work twice as hard for half as much. I pissed. The hilariously mistyped subject line I receive in response to my best friend's stepmother after I reply all to an email she sent to everyone she knows about Barack Hussein Obama. Of course, he's a Muslim. Of course, he's a black Muslim. Of course, he's not American. Of course, he's not one of us. I mean, you. I mean, I thought you were one of us. I mean, not us, but one of the good ones at least. I mean, I thought I could trust you to take it, to eat it, to smile, silent. I should have known that one day that black would slide out through that gap between your teeth, always hinting at something darker inside. I wept with my grandmother that election night. I hoped it meant they didn't hate us as much as they used to. I hoped it meant I wasn't lying to my daughter when I told her she could be anything she wants to be when she grows up. 2016. My cousin's ex-wife, a white woman who is bisexual, so of course she gets it, even if I am the only black person she knows, comes asking me about all things black, comes demanding that me and other black people I love fight harder against the regime. Obviously, we know how, we are good at it. I speak to her about lines and intersections. She responds to me by calling me Rachel Dolezal. We do not speak again. Imitation of help. My neighborhood, alive with lines, mixed fences, borders we never had to discuss, houses so large on the south end that I could only hope one day to work in them, housewives offering me folded bills to entertain their children while they jogged. Charity. We all understand our place in the ecosystem. Me, the babysitter. I read their coffee table books, learned that there was such a thing as coffee table books, books for show. At home, our books were all for reading. I ignored the food the families left for me as I feared it would taste secondhand. I learned about inferiority while the children slept, how welcome I became at their table as long as they were not at home, how they compliment my good manners while they politely disinvite my dark-skinned cousin, how we all take our places, some of us teeth, some of us swallowed. Imitation of God. They keep showing me pictures and scriptures where God looks nothing like me, and maybe that makes me some kind of heathen, but I don't believe it's the truth. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Susie, thank you for that amazing way to set up our session. Just to give you all a little bit of setup of how it's going to go, both Jeffrey Gibson and Ghada Amer are going to give us some presentations about their artwork. Then Claudia Mesch is going to read from a paper that she wrote, really responding to and thinking about their work in this history of this idea of how culture and identity has weaved its way through art history. Then we're going to have a moment to talk amongst the 4 of us and then open it up for questions for you all. So thank you again for being here and for starting this afternoon with us. So Jeffrey, do you want to?
Oh, we're just starting right in.
We're doing
we're
it.
Just going
we're diving
for
in.
it. Okay.
Big green.
Okay. So first of all, thank you. It's been really great listening to other artists today and the art historians. There's a lot of crossover, I think, between what I do, and I've known about Ghada's work for quite some time, and I'm a big fan. I chose, I think I only have about 15 slides, and just wanted to kind of go through. I start with this slide because this is really the first exhibition I did after making a major change in my materials and my work. And it came after a 2-year period from about 2009 and 2010 of traveling. I went to San Francisco, I went to France, and then came back to Brooklyn. And I was spending those 2 years trying to determine if I really wanted to continue being an artist or not. I also traveled to Winnipeg, I traveled to South Dakota, to Pine Ridge, I traveled to Oklahoma, and I traveled to Oregon. And I met with a number of traditional makers who were making regalia, dance regalia, drums, jewelry, beadwork for their communities. These people did not identify as artists. And it was sort of those conversations, I did record them. They were each about an hour, and I spoke with about 25 people. they were very healing in terms of meeting someone who was making something with the intention that what they were making would have purpose. And it was something that I wasn't finding in Brooklyn at the time, and which is why the reason I think I became so disillusioned and walked away from Brooklyn in 2009. So what was interesting is when I came back, I had a show scheduled in 2012 at Participant, and I came back and I spent 3 weeks building the work from these pieces that I had commissioned. So the pieces included, in this particular image, just the drums that you see, which is titled Drum Column. And it consists of 7 drums that I painted, and they're suspended. And what I was looking for was, because I was quite nomadic during those 2 years, I was looking for things that I could fold up, carry with me, open up into a new space. And so I carried this blanket that's painted and presented as a flag. I carried with me from San Francisco to France and back to Brooklyn. The drums were commissioned, they were made in Winnipeg by a woman who identifies as a male while she's dancing and creates personal symbolism and regalia for trans and queer dancers in Winnipeg. So amazing conversations. And so when I came back, the work suddenly, well, I should say, previous to this, I was working on canvas. I was totally a process-based abstract artist, and felt that this narrative that I'm going to talk about I was really putting it into the abstraction. What was happening, though, was that my narrative that I was trying to express was not translating to the audience, and people were very much into the formalism of the work and visually what it looked like, but they were missing all of the references. So, go to the next slide here. These pieces here are screen printed, and they're screen printed onto deer hide, which is then stretched over wood panels. And one of the things that, so this came out of a couple of places. One, it came from Parfleche, which are basically containers made from full hides that are scraped. Oftentimes they're sung to, they're prayed over, and then the designs are painted on by women only. And they're painted, the designs are oftentimes meant to identify you, identify your tribe, also to call your ancestors to bring protection to you. So what I was interested in at the time was how this geometric abstraction, in one context, let's say European and American modernism, geometric modernism, was subjective language that oftentimes was not fueled with content. And then here you have this other form of geometric abstraction, which is entirely very, very specific, an object made for someone specifically. So my interest was to try to merge these two, of course, from my own subjective place. So putting it on deer hide was interesting, because once I put it on deer hide, it kind of did all the work for me in terms of informing the viewer that I'm coming from a very specific perspective. Had I done these paintings on canvas that I bought from Dick Blick or someplace online, it's a ubiquitous canvas, but the hide actually forces you to understand that there's a surface. It's a very specific surface. So the marks that you're seeing here are, they're scrapes in the hide. Up close, you'll see things like thorns, you'll see hair follicles, sometimes you'll see a pore in the skin, you'll see a bruise. So if you look here, the second one from the right, that dark spot in the center there, is actually, it's a scar in the animal. So these pieces were really huge for me, and I think to have this painted blanket that I carried with me for about a year, and I would pull it out and I would work on a tabletop and I would paint totally subjective abstract shapes and patterns. And then to plant it into the floor at the ICA in Boston as a flag was very much about claiming a space through a subjective language of abstraction. And so for me, even though what we're going to look at, there's some painting, but really I do think about the world very much as a painter. It's really the perspective that I come from most. So this piece here, yeah, you can see, okay. So the text here says, "A number's too big to ignore," and normally I present work chronologically, but I decided this time to kind of come back and forth. This piece was made in 2015. It's fully beaded onto an acrylic wool, which is then stretched over canvas, stretched over a wood panel. And the materials are a big part of it. So, and I consider text also as a material. So the text here in "Numbers Too Big to Ignore" is certainly it's appropriated text from Helen Reddy's anthem song. But I made this piece after coming back from Winnipeg, where there's a huge number of undocumented missing Indigenous women. And I visited an exhibition there where women primarily were making moccasin tops and laying them out for all of the cases that remained open. And with Black Lives Matter continuing in the country, this was my addition to wanting to represent an Indigenous aspect to the kind of prevailing relationship, I suppose, between enforcement and the public. And so in Numbers Too Big to Ignore, and the jingles that you see across the bottom, the copper jingles, in a powwow context, are always worn by women. They are made to be moved in and to dance, so it's meant to be a healing sound when the dancers, and if you've never seen a powwow jingle dress dancer, that's how you can tell if someone has been doing it for a while. Is when you first start, it's kind of like, but in unison, when you have a huge number of women dancing, it's just, and it's really beautiful. This piece here is titled Document. It's from 2015. And so I've continued working on animal hide. And this one I wanted to restrict the color palette. Oftentimes I do go back and forth between color, back to some form of a monochrome, a tonal painting. It's graphite and acrylic, and I wanted to think about abstraction within the frame of this incredibly organic shape. And how do I fill this space with different tones? And so, and it goes onto the wall. When it's on the wall, it's held with large railroad nails, about 6-inch nails, that then goes through, and it's what stretches the hide onto the wall. This piece here is titled What We Want, What We Need. It's, how big is it up there? It's not quite that big. It's about 11.5 feet wide, and What We Want, What We Need, the text is taken from a 1990, I want to say 6, song by Public Enemy, Fight the Power, which was also about police brutality at the time. And this phrase is actually on the bag that Crystal Bridges owns, which says what we want, what we need. And for me, it's something that has always been very important to determine the difference between want and need. Growing up, being aware of my parents' choices, having gone to boarding schools, their choices to have not lived within a Native community, but to raise me, moving around the world, exposing me to many other cultures. I think that these questions of want and need have always been something that really directed my life. And I think once I really began to ponder what they really mean, have allowed me to make better decisions, to think about want and need. And so it's a phrase which I've used a couple of times. And the format, I should say, is also based on oftentimes how you will see a garment, an Indigenous garment, not just Native American, but from many cultures, a robe, for instance, that is hung on the wall with the arms extended. So the formats that I choose are also influenced by a number of different histories. So I want to say this is 2014, and the punching bag started in 2011. And was a very cathartic series of work. There are 40 bags in total. This one says people like us, and text comes into the picture probably around bag number 20, somewhere around there, 2022. And it has to do with this play of abstraction, subjectivity, speaking on behalf of a larger community, being recognized as part of a larger community. And people like us is actually a quote taken from artist Sister Corita Kent, who was a screen printer in primarily the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But she was a nun, and when she discovered screen printing, she saw it as this way to speak to the youth about God and spread the word. And her openness really opened up for all of these countercultural movements to come in and start printing their own messages in screen printing. So people like us, she also appropriated text from a number of different places. So she's someone who I kind of consider as like a teacher in terms of how I've learned how to use text, which has been a part of this learning curve over the last 5 or 6 years. And with this one in particular, so that what you see around the Everlast word are actually my paintings that I made when I first moved to New York in 1999. And I saved those paintings, and by some point they only represented my failure because they would go out for exhibit, they would come back. Every time they would leave, you have these high, tremendous hopes, and then when they return, they just seem sort of like they're coming back from war or something. And one day, out of, I think, sheer desperation, I took a razor and I cut them all off, and I took them to the laundromat, and I washed them again and again and again. And what happened was the paint didn't shrink, but the cotton of the canvas did. So it caused some of the paint to pop off. I sanded them, and they eventually transformed into textiles that then could be used in any number of ways. This is a kind of patchwork of about 3 or 4 different paintings. And then people like us in the color red were certainly choices to try to inject both personal and some sort of identifiable content into the formal choices. So the color red, speaking of like the red people, which I believe it's also, I know that there's another person who's Choctaw in here, so I'm gonna look for a validation, but Homa, right, means the people, but it also means red. I have to think about that again, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, but so thinking about that, like how do I inject content into both materials and also into my formal choices? These figures emerged from the punching bag series because the punching bags really became very figurative to me when I was thinking about what to put onto a punching bag or how to work with adornment. It's always been, well, the background to that is growing up, oftentimes Native American material culture would be found in the decorative arts, the natural history and also the decorative arts. And so for me, what I know is that when you understand what you're looking at, it is not just decorative, because the decorative implies just surface, or it implies that somehow there's something just visual without meaning. These jingles, for instance, originally would have been the lids of tobacco and snuff containers that were traded, and then people would turn them and adorn dresses. And it eventually became a dance, and eventually became a female dance, which is a healing dance. And so the beadwork that's on here is done in the studio. These are about, I want to say about 40 inches tall, not including the block. And so there's a number of these. This one's titled Burn For You. So this one, 2013. Once I started working with text, and I've always titled the work quite elaborately, so text wasn't new to me, but putting it directly on the surface of an artwork just felt like you were laying your soul bare, you know? But what's interesting about words and text is they're just as slippery as a color or as something completely abstract. The words on here say white power, and I knew that I wanted to choose words that engaged a formal color very specifically, but also that I knew these words, white power, were provocative. And as ugly as those words are to me in my life and in my family's life, I also know that you see this image, and it's the wedding, it's the christening, it's the fresh paint of white on a canvas or in a new room when you move into a house. So there's this contradiction, again, about thinking that any color is simply just a formal choice. And I suppose for me an argument that it's never just a formal choice, that there's always somehow meaning inherent in the choice. And so this bag, of course, then it led to sort of like we could do a black power bag and a red power bag and a pink power bag. And so I think that's kind of how the work generates. You know, it's just kind of exploring. This piece is from 2015. It's a larger wall hanging. And so all of the color and the text is all beaded. And I'll read it. American history is longer, larger, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. And the JB is attributing this to James Baldwin. And James Baldwin, Nina Simone, Grace Jones, these are all people who recur in the work quite a bit. They're people who I've identified with. They're people who have articulated feelings that I had or somehow released anger by articulating it for me. And that's one of my reasons. I do see them as homages to these words and to these people. Those 3 people in particular are important to me because they all left the US. in order to pursue their creativity. And it's something that I have chosen not to do. I'm very determined to have these conversations about American culture and American history in America. And so it is something that I think hearing people talk this week has been very interesting to understand that maybe that's where we're at, is kind of unpacking another many, many layers to history. And personalizing it, I think, between the artists and the other speakers. So that's this piece. There's jingles across the bottom, and then the fringe on the sides is wool yarn. This is a very recent piece. This is from 2017, and this is a pretty ambitious one. Once I've been working with text for some time, I started thinking about conversations. I started thinking about call and response. Excuse me, both of my grandfathers were Southern Baptist ministers and began Indian churches, one in central Mississippi and one in central Oklahoma. And so I used to go to church, and call and response was a big thing that would happen that I took from that. So I think a lot about language, about how conversations, also the relationship to like the diptych or the triptych, like two voices, an intimate conversation, an argument. This one here is actually the same phrase, just the color shifts, and it says, "Our freedom is worth more than our pain." And it's 9.5 feet tall, and so the scales of justice can be weighted on either side. These larger figurative pieces came from the smaller ones, so the kind of 40 to 48 inch tall ones that you saw previously. This was interesting. This really came from a very impulsive place of wanting to make these. And once I started showing them, what I realized was there's really no body. The garment is the body in this. And so that's begun what I'm working on currently, that the body is really a garment as a transformational body, right? So when you put on an exceptional, extraordinary garment, you become a different person in that moment. And of course, relative to ceremonial garments. And so I think there's just a detail of what's going on here. And just for time's sake, I'm just going to go through these last slides. This is one of the first ones, one of the first little guys. These are a little darker in nature. I kind of see these as these ancestral spirits roaming the earth, and they just have a couple of things to say to you. This one says, "What do you want, and when do you want it?" And I think this is the last slide. This is the most recent large wall hanging, and it says, "I am alive, you are alive, they are alive, we are living." And then it repeats as if it's a chant. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I have a lot of slides to show you, a lot of images. And I am going to present my work not chronologically, but rather in groups, because I am mainly famous for my paintings with embroidery, but I do much more than that, it's difficult that people know about it. So I grouped my work in paintings, drawings, sculpture, garden work, and lately ceramics. So before I start my presentation, I just want to give you a little bit of a background of myself, because that will explain as well the work that I do. So I am originally from Egypt, and I moved to France when I was 11, and then I moved to America when I was 30, about 33. So I went to France, and I studied art in France, and I wanted to become a painter. But in 1986, the teacher in the art department refused to teach painting to women. And I was very shocked, because at that time, As well, I was struggling with what is going on in Egypt with all of the veil going, like all of the women's status and all of the conservatism that was happening in the 80s, because it did all start in the 80s. It didn't start now, all of the going backward in the religion and all of what we are hearing now. I have witnessed it myself in the 80s, where when I grew up in Egypt, nobody was veiled. And then more and more, I go back to Egypt and everybody's veiled, everybody's speaking about religion, and it was very scary for me. But in the same time, when I grew up in France, I didn't want, I was feeling French. I didn't want anybody to identify me like Arab or like Egyptian or like woman. And here I am in France in the 80s when I was grown up already, a guy who said, no, the woman cannot paint. And I was pretty shocked because I have had to deal with a lot of problem regarding women, and this one in France, I didn't expect that. So I left to America, actually. I went to Boston to study, and then for a semester only. And then here I had like a lot of people talking about feminism and women, and when the guy didn't want women to study, I stayed there, and then he would take all the men and teach them painting, and then we had to wait outside and then ask the men, okay, so how do you do this, how to this? I found it very demeaning. Yeah. Then I went to the library and I started to study to see what was the woman painter in France. And I found none of them in the art history books. And I found in the art history they don't actually teach any woman. It never even occurred to me. It was like if this was normal. So by this person not allowing the woman to paint, it actually helped me a little bit realize, but wait a minute, maybe painting is just a man's world. Maybe it is only the men who have invented painting. So I decided actually to use something that is specifically from the woman's world, which is embroidery, and to paint with it. And throughout my career, I think until now, this is my mission. One of my missions in painting is to paint with embroidery. Just because I wanted all the time to ask this question, what is our role in this painting history? So this is what I've been doing and struggling with it. Oh, how does it work?
The big green, that one.
No. Okay. So this is my first, this is 1991. This is when I decided, of course, I didn't even dare to embroider at school or to even say this. I had to go to the drawing department. So, so this is called 5 Women at Work, and it's a quadriptych of 4 women actually, doing housework, and the 5th woman was me, the artist, embroidering. So this was my first painting statement. So I've been doing like all of this series of women at work from 1991 to 1993, this was for me trying to paint. Then I was a little bit like frustrated with this series of painting because I said, this is not really painting, it's still drawings. So I had to switch the whole like technicality. I started to realize that first I didn't want to have the woman, submissive woman, as a subject. So I took my woman from porn magazine, so from men's realm, and then I started to make the tail of the embroidery longer, and this has become my drips. And with the repetition, I could actually have all over of repeated images, and then have drips of painting. And this is how I started to explore the technicality of the painting this way. So this is some, and then of course I have a lot of reference to the male painter, the Alberts, all of the abstract expressionism, etc., etc. These are, I paint as well with words. I use words a lot. I have always used words, and probably it's because of my upbringing. When I was young, I've never seen an image, actually. I saw the image, the first painting when I moved to France. I've always seen words, but for me, so words and so I've always seen like painted words in my youth. I started by seeing this when I grew up. Then in France, I started to see the figures. So for me, I have no problem going from the figures to the words. For me, it's the same. So I use this and that, whatever I feel like inspires me. So this is a series of, no woman can call herself free unless she controls her own body. It's, all the time I like very much to use quotation, because always quotation is a mark of, if I say it myself, it's people can say, oh, it's right or wrong, but if it's a quotation, it's always this voice of the people who know, who are more knowledgeable, and it's a little bit authoritarian, I find. So I like very much as well to use this. So this is a series called rfgA, which is painting. RF stands for Reza Farkhandi and Ghada Amer, and the painting that is here in Crystal Bridges is part of this rfgA series. And this is as well, it happened by accident. I studied when I was in France in school. There was no, at the time, any Muslim artist or from the Middle East. The first person that I met at school was Reza, who is from Iran, who came to study at school. And then we had a lot of conversation about how does it feel to be like a contemporary artist, because usually you can feel at the time like art was very much a white, like Western concept. We don't talk about any art history in Africa or any art history in the Middle East, and it felt a little bit for us exclusive. So we kind of all the time were talking about how does it feel and what's the difference. And then I like to see some contemporary artist, Iranian at the time, he liked to see, so, but nobody would share this interest because they were not interested. Anyway, so we had a very big friendship. And then in 2000, he got very depressed, and he decided he's not painting anymore. And then I was traveling, we shared studio, and then he decided to paint on my canvas uninvited. And I was very, very upset when I came back. He said, like, what are you doing? I said, no, I'm trying to help you. If you don't want it, just erase it, because I think your background are very bad. It's becoming a little bit, so I'm trying to help you. I said, okay. And then I was very surprised, but for him, it was the only way to get out of his, because he thought that because he paints, he's depressed. But if he would to paint on my canvas, he wouldn't be depressed. This was his logic. Then, so he would paint on my canvas, I would go outside, and then he would I would add something, and then he would, when I go out, he would add something. So I thought it was a very funny situation. So I came to him, I said, oh, I think we are collaborating. And then he was like, we're not collaborating. This is not art. I don't care. You don't say to anybody that we are collaborating. And then everybody was asking, so how did you do this? I was like, oh. So I decided to give to this series of painting an acronym, like as a war acronym, rfgA. It's like nobody, so that, because I knew that this was something that was not normal, and this is developing, like taking my work into another direction. So, this is the series of rfgA that we still continue to do until now. Until actually 2005, when he became much better and he realized that, yes, okay, it's collaboration. But it was kind of too late to go back to sign all of the canvas that we did together, that he didn't acknowledge that it was a collaboration. So we started in 2005. So we continued the rfgA under the label of rfgA because it had become kind of its own label. And then we have done a series of drawings on paper, and that he signed finally, like together. So because we had done the rfgA, we kind of know how to collaborate. We haven't never set any rules of collaboration, apart from this very strange collaboration where I start something, he continues, he starts. So for 5 years we have been collaborating, and this was so natural for us to continue the collaboration. So this is the drawing, or And I like it because he is now like, he's a man, so nobody can tell me, oh, it's a feminist art. So I said, no, there's a man who is, and he's in all the feminist show, he's the only man. So this is part of something that I quite like as well. And then there is a part as well of my work that I like very much to work outside, because I like to do sculpture, but before I did sculpture, I as well like to work with the nature, at least with outside, because I don't believe only to have just an object in the nature like this and that everybody comes and like, but it has to be part of the nature. And I call them the gardens. It's not with the nature, but you will see, understand. So this is a piece I did in Santa Fe, and I chose this this land where there was tramps and people homeless going there, and I made a love park. And it is benches that I sliced into two halves, and on each half I put another quotation about love and life that are contradictory. So you walk into this park with reading two different things that are contradictory, and you never sit with your partner, and it's always so. This is some of the quotation that I have chosen. Okay. And this is a piece I did in 2007, 2004, I don't remember. It was just before the American attacked Iraq, and I was, of course, very upset about this war, about any war, but this as well particular, especially that all of these people that are making war, they have lived 1968, and they were these like cool, Baba cool people, peace and love, and then the same people suddenly they return and become very aggressive. So I decided to, this is exactly the same week of the attack, so I did this peace sign and this peace sign is done with carnivorous plant. And I had made a performance, I had made a cocktail, I invited people to a cocktail where I give them live worms and live crickets, and they had to feed the plants. And this is another piece I did. This installation is in Italy, but it started at the Queen's Museum first. I was very interested about a garden they have. That people they could rent and just make photographs for the newly wedded people. And I found it very fascinating to have this photo of the wedding. So I asked if I could do something, and they didn't want me to do anything in this. They refused because it was sacred. It's beautiful. I'm going to destroy it. So I decided to do my own garden of people wedding. So it's the word happily ever after, and then with it's like, so it's done with this iron thread, like iron rods, and then the jasmine plant is the one who's going to make the letter. But then if you want to take a picture, you never have the happily ever after. So you're the ever happy. Then this was the point. So this is my. And then this is the sculpture where it is like object, not like the garden where I use the plants or like. And this is called Encyclopedia of Pleasure. And this, weirdly enough, I've done this piece 1 year just before September 11, and I was supposed to have a show in October 2011. And this was a very fascinating, actually. I think this is before story. My sister is a scholar. She's a very smart girl. She has PhD and she reads books without images. I was always very fascinated. Wow. And she was working on this book, on this. She was like all the time, I'm trying to find that book. She was trying to find a book that was forbidden. And she said, it's called Encyclopedia of Pleasure, and it's a book that has been written in the Middle Ages by this guy. I have all of the reference. And then it's an encyclopedia of pleasure, meaning that this guy compiled things that were totally about pleasure, sexuality in the Arab Muslim world. And it starts like this: in the name of God, I'm going to teach you how to become a better Muslim. And in order to become a better Muslim, you have to become a better human being. And in order to become a better human being, you have to become a better sexual being. And that's why I am doing this book, so that you are become a better Muslim. So, and it's all about sexuality. And this book has been very famous in the Arab Muslim world. And in the 50s, it has been put into a lock. It is forbidden. And nobody knew about it, except my sister, of course, who's a nerd. She has to find the... So it was so fascinating for me, because she wanted to understand why the Muslim people have become so stiff and retarded about sexuality and problematic. So this was her research, and then she researched it, and then she found the book. She found the book in Canada. She found, actually not the book, but she found it because she would ask in Egypt and go to have access to the book. They would deny her. It was one I think it was one in Egypt, one in Turkey, and two in Iraq, like in the library, but nobody was allowed to have access. And she had traced the book when this guy in Canada had access to the book, and he had translated a very bad translation, and so she had access to the book, and then she sent it, and I asked her to send me a copy because I was fascinated as well by her research. It was, and to read a forbidden book was very exciting for me, especially about sexuality. I was like, okay, I need to know what's going on. So I've done this. So this is the story of this piece. So, and I chose to embroider this forbidden book on those boxes, because culture is saved by other culture. You know, like when there is a problem, you always take your books and stuff, and then you move somewhere else. Or the other culture try to save, like what the Muslim culture has saved as well, the Christian culture when it was Dark Ages. So for me, it was kind of a little bit the same way. And this kind of as well embroidery, it is an embroidery that is very fashionable right now, to put like Quranic text with this embroidery. So I chose to use the same way of embroidering and to put it in these boxes. But I have chosen from this book to only embroider the passages that speak about women's sexuality, because I thought it was a very funny a man who can speak about women's sexuality. It was a very interesting. So it's not the whole encyclopedia that I have embroidered on these 54 boxes, but just the part that would speak about women's sexuality. And just to share with you, this is the lexicon of the book. It's very interesting, and so this is all of the chapters of the book. I find it very fascinating. I don't know. It's just because, yeah. Jealousy. Then this is 2010. These are excerpts of my work. I have. It's not. So this is 2010. This is as well my sister. It's like, you know, Ghada, we have 100 words that speak of love in Arabic, and we don't use any of them. I said, yes, it's true, especially right now with all of the violence. So she told me, I'm gonna find you the 100 words. So I said, yes, find me. I want to make this sculpture. So we did compile the 100 words of love. And I made this sculpture. At the time, I wanted to make empty sculpture. And so this is 100 words of love in Arabic. This is made out of resin. This is the size, to give you just the size. So, and I have the same boots matching. But and this is stainless steel. Then I started to be very interested in sculpture and objects that are not just embroidery, since this 2010 sculpture with 100 words of love. And so I developed all of this, I hate this name, but everybody's called them the egg-shaped sculpture. But so this is called the Brubra Girls, and it's figurative and abstraction, the same. This is the size, just to give you a size. And this is the words of love I love the most. So it's some of the words of the 100 words of love that I took, but made them in the bronze. And then my last discovery is ceramics. I've done this since 3 years. These are not my recent ceramics. I just opened the show yesterday, like the day before yesterday, at a very small show at the GHP, Greenwich House Pottery. But this is within my first residency 2 years ago. So these are like very tall, like ceramics, like this. Big, like the size, I don't know exactly. I don't know, it's written here, no.
I wanted to thank Lauren and Anne for this invitation to Crystal Bridges. I've really enjoyed my time here so far. I also really enjoyed meeting Jeffrey and Ghada. What a treat it's been for me. So I'd like to make some comments about the critical context for this panel, a specific aspect of cultural exchange. Can people hear me? Yes? Okay. A specific aspect of cultural exchange in art that is the issue of the melting pot in American culture, which has to do with the sociological phenomenon of assimilation, as it's realized for newcomers to a given group, culture, or society. Thankfully, art history no longer adheres to the idea of the purity of visual cultures that are somehow true to themselves in isolation. Scholars recognize that going back to antiquity, cultural encounters and exchanges have happened in trade, travel, in the relocations of people in expat communities, and in migrations and immigrations. All of these developments resulted in the meeting, melding, and altering of cultures. And beyond other nations globally, North America has been recognized as being at the forefront of cultural encounter among peoples of the world. But I think it's fair to say that art history is only beginning to account for the heterogeneity and complexity of visual and material culture in the Americas. After I say a few more words about cultural exchange, modern assimilation, and art, I'll take a brief historical excursion to think about how assimilation might be witnessed in earlier works of American art, some of which are located here in the Crystal Bridges collections. Finally, I'd like to offer some observations about the work of Ghada Amer and Jeffrey Gibson, which situates us to think about artistic assimilation as a global enterprise in the 21st century. In producing new configurations of visual and intellectual traditions that are heterogeneous to begin with, they address the complexity of American artistic identity in the present. It's been noted that exchanges between cultures fall into different categories and that some are positive or friendly and others less so. For example, historical events of imperialism and colonialism are instances of nationalist aggression, which is also cultural exchange. In it, a dominant power emerges and advances only its own best interest. This is cultural interaction at just about its moral and ethical worst. Beginning with the large-scale population movements of immigration and migration to the US of the 19th century, we can identify a more specific dynamic of exchange between cultures, since travel, trade, and relocation don't happen in a vacuum. but are part of the larger social, political, and economic developments. The fascinating and complex term cultural assimilation was first coined by the American sociologist Milton Gordon in 1964. It described the phenomenon he observed of particular stages of acclimation or acculturation that occurred when a group with a different historical background is introduced into another larger group, and the boundaries between the groups are lessened over time. These stages of change and adaptation have also been called the melting pot. However, critics of this idea note that melting pot also implicitly puts forward the idea that Anglo culture was actually being positioned as not only dominant but normative, which was then actually forcing other ethnicities to shed their own home cultures and instead take up the stronger alternative. This definition of the melting pot of assimilation is then quite a negative notion about a forced or necessary conforming to an implicitly Anglo culture on the part of new or marginalized groups for the sake of survival. The notion has rightly come to convey a sense of loss, since assimilating is then a kind of forced forgetting of one's home culture in taking on or adapting to a dominant one. Okay. How art articulates this phenomenon of adaptation changes over time and in particular contexts. We might consider, for example, portraits of new Jewish Eastern European immigrants to the US and to US cities around or before the turn of the 20th century. I found this drawing in the Crystal Bridges collections by the San Francisco artist Henry Alexander, the child of Jewish immigrants who settled there. Dating to 1884, it is titled The Cap Maker. Alexander takes us into the rooms of a factory devoted to garment manufacturing, to picture an anonymous, formally dressed immigrant worker in either San Francisco or New York, since Alexander worked in both cities. He shows us a worker who is likely new to the US and who had to adapt to a new urban American culture, a process of relocation and adjustment that Alexander was also familiar with because of his own circumstances. The term has also been applied to African American artists who relocated to the North around the same time in the Great Migration, and who then had to navigate their own place in urban and predominantly white culture. Artists like Romare Bearden, who is represented in the collections here, or earlier artists of the Harlem Renaissance, Aaron Douglas and Jacob Lawrence, addressed this subject in their artworks and introduced elements of African American culture into modernist considerations of urban life. In his famous Projection series, first exhibited in 1964, Bearden took on the subject of the displacement of migration and the new urban assimilation that he himself had experienced in turning to photomontage, a medium that was new to his art. The medium, devised by the Berlin Dadaists during World War I, was an apt and perceptive choice, since it is based in the fragmenting of photographic images, a process that arguably has certain parallels to the disorienting experience of being transplanted into the city as a new environment. And incidentally, this work is titled Evening, 910, 461 Lenox Avenue. Another negative dynamic of cultural exchange in the US and Europe is appropriation. Okay, there we go. The wholesale co-opting of images and objects of a marginalized culture that then ironically ends up being about the identity and coherence of the dominant culture. What's known as modernist primitivism was all about this, which arguably began with the Fauvists like Matisse and can be observed in Picasso's use of African masks, for example. Another appropriation strategy was devised by the French surrealists, who were obsessed not so much with depicting, but rather with amassing indigenous objects, collecting them, and integrating them into surrealist exhibitions and displays featuring their own art. And here, I'm of course showing you a famous wall of André Breton's apartment in Paris, which included, of course, an installation of his own art as well as his collection, ethnographic collection. This accomplished two things. The surrealists thereby made artifacts from indigenous cultures somehow surrealist, and by extension, also made a case for the possibility that their own art could also take on an alternative reality like that of the distinct worldviews and theologies of other cultures, of native culture, for example. But appropriation worked quite differently in the settler society that was the United States. Native American art historians Ruth Phillips and Bill Anthus have used the term settler modernism to distinguish native culture and art from Anglo-modern art in the US of the 19th and early 20th century. The American West was colonized by Anglos as a settler society, which was of course based on the takeover of land from indigenous people. As part of this displacement, aspects of native culture were also literally erased. This is perhaps most cruelly realized in the de-ethnicizing of native children who were separated from their families and sent to Indian schools to become Christian and ethnically Anglo, a process that erased the identities of children and young people, basically making them no one and imposing on them an almost unimaginable existential crisis. The dynamic of colonization of the US settler society also demanded an erasure of native visual culture, which was in part achieved by means of attributing a notion of mythic authenticity to Native Americans in visual art. Where native culture was acknowledged, it was through the lens of an Anglo vision of what it should be. This was recoded as authentic. Alfred Bierstadt's undated painting depicts natives in an idyllic paradise untouched by settlers, forced relocations, or by the wars, which we know took place in these years. Bierstadt sees natives as part of nature, which had to be tamed or civilized. Or in the case of Edward Curtis's documentary, quote, images, his photographs present native people almost like butterfly specimens or pressed flowers, fragile beings who are presented with the idea that one must preserve their image since this culture was disappearing. Such images also established native culture as rooted in a distant past, separate from and unrelated to modern times or modern life. But another Crystal Bridges artwork by John Sloan certainly debunks this visual myth of Native American authenticity untouched and hermetically preserved. His Indian Detour of 1927 points out that, in fact, cheap tourism had undermined authentic native dances and ritual. Native ritual had been transformed into large-scale spectacles. In Sloane's etching, a few native dancers and their small kivas in the near distance, so hopefully you can make that, oh, sorry, no, back. Yes, here are the native dancers, here are a few kivas, but then, a few native dancers and their small kivas in the distance are rendered almost invisible amongst a crush of tourist buses and Anglo spectators. It is, that is Sloan, is a sarcastic refusal of the ongoing Anglo construction of the non-modern Native American in visual art. Dominant Anglo culture in the US also established conventions about the authentic artist, the sphere of action that was proper to an artist and which was also gender-specific. William Merritt Chase's wonderful late 19th century portrait of Worthington Whitridge shows us that the artist was male. He was best positioned next to the medium that mattered, painting. In contrast, another painting in the Crystal Bridges collection of about the same time by Gary Melchers almost incidentally depicts a woman of the Gilded Age with her needlework, as though she was not able to conceal it quickly enough to evade the observation of the artist. The composition makes clear that craft work was a distant and lesser cousin to painting. There is, however, a complexity to Melcher's painting. The woman's embroidery is almost hidden, but it is clearly contrasted with the painting behind it. Though it was unrecognized as such in its time, the artist, I think, understood this craft as an artwork. But once you begin to examine it, questions of artistic and visual assimilation are often quite complex in modern American art, as has become clear in my research on the work of the Ojibwe artist George Morrison, and work that he himself called surrealist. Can his surrealist artworks, for example, his exquisite corpse drawings or his biomorphic abstractions like this one, be understood as counter or re-appropriations, putting appropriation in reverse in relation to the surrealists? As Morrison was engaged with surrealist techniques and strategies throughout his life, these artworks can't be understood as youthful errors or aberrations. He was very deliberate and precise about the usefulness of surrealism to his own art into the late 20th century. Interestingly, art historians of native modernism generally don't engage with this aspect of his art, likely because it does not fit their categories of how a native modernist like Morrison worked and expressed himself after 1945. But like other post-war art historians of native modernism participate in the purging out of surrealism from the American scene and context of the 40s and early 50s. This rejection of the very real contact between American artists with surrealism, and not only in New York, began while the category of abstract expressionism was still being constructed in art criticism and art history as a kind of homegrown and purely American development. I wanted to show you another George Morrison painting, Three Figures, this one from 1945. Within 20th century modernism, American artists were culturally diverse and exceedingly cosmopolitan in their approaches to artistic process and technique. They synthesized formalist influences selectively at various times and in different artworks. They reconfigured the dynamics of appropriation in critical and authoritative ways. We need to work harder to map and chart the cultural complexity and diversity that characterized 20th century American modernisms. It hardly needs to be said that we live in a much different world than that of even the late 20th century. The types of cultural exchange I've mentioned are generally dualistic and based in two exchanging cultures. Perhaps this earlier understanding of the contained unitary nature of cultures is rooted in biased and exclusionary ideas of national identity, which most of the time had to do with the dominant Anglo culture we've already discussed. Since then, arguably beginning in the 1990s, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, national borders and nationalism itself has been redefined. Though just as a side note, it seems that recent events point to the sentiment that a return to nationalistic notions of economy is possible, and that this return can be ushered in by a kind of rejiggered and renationalized culture. I'd be interested in hearing any thoughts from the artists if they want to talk about this later, if they're comfortable in talking about that. The notion of a cultural globalizing of contemporary life generally parallels a neoliberal view of economics that has a foundation in emerging, investor-driven markets that spread beyond national borders and beyond the control or oversight of any single national or even global entity. This neoliberal idea of the free and open markets of a global economy has been central to the phenomenon of globalization. Two key technologies have enabled the development of this post-nationalism: unlimited quick air travel between international airports and instantaneous worldwide communication and asset transfer enabled by a global internet. Nevertheless, current transport and communication networks enable professionals in various vocations, intellectuals and artists to become cosmopolitan polyglots and to move between and among what had previously been distant and distinct cultures. Now I come back to the artists on the panel here. Cultural exchange has taken on new meaning, as can be illustrated by work of the American artist Ghada Amer, who is fluent in 3 languages and is thus truly a global citizen. She anchors her artworks in Arabic, French, and American visual, literary, and mass cultures, sometimes moving between all of them in a single artwork. In globalized, mediated contemporary life, cultural exchange is no longer dual, but multivalent and hybrid. It has become more difficult to categorize cultures as dominant or marginal in music, as well as in visual realms, as they oftentimes meet and entwine and then mutate into something else. Ghada Amer and Jeffrey Gibson both work in this field of multiple cultural interactions within the globalized corporate media on the one hand, and in the international art world on the other, in ways that address public and intimate aspects of identity. Ghada and Jeffrey's art implicitly rejects and contests old essentialist categories. They resist conventions of authenticity in American art. The negotiation of cultures in Ghada's art happens through the filter of feminism and with a continual commitment to the equality for women. She's an American artist who, and you know some of this already, sorry, who emigrated from Egypt to France as a child where she trained as an artist. Notably, she was excluded from French painting courses, she told us, that were still, even in the 1980s, reserved for men only. After this, she dedicated a good portion of her work toward the contestation and unsettling of assumptions about how painting functions and for whom. She also works in sculpture, ceramics, installation, and has designed gardens in the US and abroad. In postmodernist fashion, Ghada juxtaposes selected corporate mass media representations of femininity, from Disney animations to those of the pornography industry, that constrict women almost literally from the cradle to the grave, yet does so without explicit comment. This work is Snow White Without the Dwarves of 2008. One infers her position is critical of such capitalist-geared objectification, but at the same time she celebrates explicit depictions of female sexuality in erotica. Her position then resists feminist orthodoxies and feminist generational conflicts in taking up both sides of the debate. She embraces celebratory images of the female body that are eschewed by conceptual third-wave feminists, while also adopting some of the preferences of the third wave, for example, for text-based compositions. Her feminism is not exclusive to either camp, nor perhaps to post-feminism, a category devised by feminists of color to argue for the need for feminism to also account for female ethnic subjectivities. Her work, Test 8 from 2013, indicates she is sympathetic to the anti-essentialist ideas of French feminism as they are articulated by Simone de Beauvoir, whom she quotes directly here, quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." That is, of course, from The Second Sex. Ghada seems interested in tracing the routes of how we as women are acculturated or assimilated into our femininity. She also articulates the post-feminist idea that feminism must open itself to many contestations of gender difference outside the West, and to the notion that the difference of femininity is varied, multiple, mutable, and therefore perhaps indefinable. And you've seen this already. She is often intermedial, for example, in expanding abstract sculpture to include text, as in her installation Encyclopedia of Pleasure, which we just heard about before, which features cubes embroidered with passages about female sexuality that she selected from a progressive 12th century Arabic text. I also have a detail of that. But what's also, I think, significant is that the embroidery, the text here is in English. So moving between different cultures, even in that. Her, Crystal Bridges' work, Big Black Bang, rfgA, at first glance references the iconic black paintings of minimalism. But it is also a delicate, collaborative embroidery that conceals painted and embroidered erotic images of women on the surface below. I don't know if Ghada agrees, but isn't this work also dealing with embroidery as ornament, but also embroidery as a concealing surface, which resonates in some ways with the very loaded notion of veiling as a cultural practice in Islamic societies? Asked it as a question, okay? All right. Anyway, I don't want to be reductive, and I know Ghada wouldn't let me do that anyway. But it is a practice that has been argued to be critical of Western hegemonic ideas about feminine identity. Finally, I can observe that Ghada's art explores the notion of beauty as a formalist ideal. She also takes on what I would say at this historical juncture is a very important notion, the vastness and even unfathomability of the human emotion of love. Switching to Jeffrey's work. Jeffrey is also occupied with the contesting of conventions that relegate Native Americans to a distant past, which oftentimes happens in the high art mediums of painting and sculpture. Born in Colorado, Jeffrey has lived and worked in Korea, Germany, and England, as well as in Chicago and New York. He works in painting and sculpture as well as in performance. He is a member of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians and is also Cherokee. His art charts his bridging of aspects of international urban life, like club and rave culture and techno music on the one hand, with native music and the forms and materials of traditional native art on the other. The latter is usually tied to what is now called non-metro culture, which also references the spaces of the reservation. In Jeffrey's art, the practice of traditional native craft is brought to bear on, fuse with, transform the surfaces of objects privileged in the contemporary art world, such as the found or repurposed, recycled object, or the two-dimensional surface of painting. His work consistently negates any romantic vision of Native American life and culture. He uses materials like artificial sinew, metal, jingles, or hide of the variety that decorate the regalia that Native women wear in powwow ceremonies to work his objects, as in what we want, what we need. I'm showing you here again Crystal Bridges' work here in Crystal Bridges. A number of his objects suggest the moving body of another, but not the other, a totalizing term that I think one needs to be very careful about using. His series of decorated or embroidered punching bags are always still emblazoned with the logo and word Everlast, which is both appropriated as well as a kind of mantra for the continual resilience of outsiders or marginalized people. These are objects taken from boxing culture, where there are obvious stand-ins for a physical opponent. They also simulate the weight and the motion, the weave, the swagger, stagger of a human form. Like Ghada, Jeffrey often uses text to punctuate his beaded or embroidered surfaces, and his references vary. He cribs titles of songs by the Stone Roses or other recognizable top 40 hits that mock the romantic and also cultural idea of disappearance. You're going to miss me when I'm gone. And also references the neo-conceptual art of Jenny Holzer and her truisms at the same time. Jeffrey also completed, as he told us, a longer painting series of geometric abstractions, and in 2013 incorporated found teepee poles into them. Here, teepee poles performing as lines, scene 3. I bring these up because I really like your abstract works. More recent paintings are at very large scale and are furthermore visually stunning and, yes, beautiful, such as Raven of 2016. As has been noted, these paintings reference the tradition of the parfleche of the Plains Indians, hide bags, boxes that were decorated with brightly colored geometric designs. These indigenous objects were certainly precedents to the Euro-American pursuit of abstraction, a fact that Western modern art history generally continues to ignore, but not for a whole lot longer, one hopes. Both Ghada and Jeffrey situate us in a present that now characterizes American art. As art historian Thomas Crow observed long ago, the present is a space and situation that modern art of the 20th century was able to access with only the greatest of difficulty. They bring us to a current moment of global cultural adaptation and change that goes beyond the melting pot of assimilation. And they acknowledge the perseverance this requires in an era of globalized media and travel. That's why I've become very fond of one of Jeffrey's artworks in particular, and his clever synthesizing of Robert Frost's ruminations from a poem of 1914. Jeffrey's artwork is titled, "The Only Way Out is Through." Their art is a fusion and realignment, a finding of this best way out by going through. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Ghada. Thank you, Jeffrey, for those really fantastic presentations. And really, I think, so this topic, this idea of cultural assimilation, appropriation, this idea of the melting pot, particularly also, though, as evidenced through the way that artists, particularly artists of color, use their own cultural identity in their work, is a huge topic. It's, you know, there are symposiums alone really about it. So I don't expect us to solve any questions, big questions here today, but really, I think also loving the way that Susie Q talked about it as this idea of a mosaic and not as much as a melting pot in this ideal world. So I wonder if you all can maybe start with that, this idea of a mosaic, a mixing of cultures that exist together as parts of one whole, versus this idea of a melting pot where everything sort of gets swirled together. Jeffrey, you start.
Well, it's interesting. I think with both my work and with Ghada's work, I think we tried to, or what I see in the work, is we represent kind of a full spectrum of a situation. And that's probably the world that we've both grown up in and that we exist in now. So it's not so much a construction of a narrative as much as it's just like taking away the veil and the editing of the narrative that we inherited. So you're just sort of like clearly, as best as you can, acknowledging all of the parts that make up my background and my present and what I hope for the future. And I think that's. It's interesting thinking about the word political because I understand why that can be seen as political, but since I've been here since yesterday, very briefly, I think about it as acknowledgement. You know, to acknowledge the reality of the materials, the culture, the histories around us, without trying to edit out with an agenda to highlight or to heighten any particular aspect of it, and. So in that sense, I guess, you know, for me, the melting pot was I didn't want to melt. Like I never wanted to melt.
No.
I didn't want to become a lighter shade of chocolate or anything like that. I just wanted to be myself and maintain my difference with dignity and respect and some level of integrity.
Yeah. And do you think, I really appreciate that because it's this idea of, you know, the American story and the multiple stories that exist within this. Why is it there's often such a pushback on that it becomes this idea that it is a political action to actually really, you were just making the work that only you can make. You were telling your authentic story, this idea of Ghada being born in one place, raised in another, spending time and really being trained as an artist in others, and it's all part of the work. It's not so much a rejection of anything except who you are, but yet there's always this pushback.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to melt. I really wanted to melt because I tried to melt,
Yeah.
but I couldn't melt. I don't know, maybe because I came from another culture. Actually, my parents did not immigrate. I immigrated. My parents went to France to study, to make a PhD, and they were going back. So and we were going back. There was not this notion of, and then when I came to France, I was 11. And it's a very age where you want to be like everybody else. You don't want to stand out. You don't want to be different. So I tried to speak French like the French. I would and I thought I would. I looked like them. I spoke like them. And then I don't have the same color. I don't have the same hair. I have nothing. And then each time they were like pointing out to me this difference. And then the more they pointed, the more I tried to speak better French and better, and it was, and then I lost the battle, and then I realized, you know what? But this is after I suffered. I really was not happy about it. But very late. I think it's when I came to America that I said, oh, I don't care if I don't, because I had given up already, and they were always. Actually, I wanted to melt. They didn't want me to melt.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think both my mother and father went to Indian boarding schools, and both speak. When my mother speaks Cherokee, my father speaks Choctaw. But when they left their communities growing up, there was really no value to the language. You know, when no one else is speaking the language back to you. And then, of course, they were forced to not speak it in boarding schools. And so I think, for me, I kind of walked into a celebration of melting, you know, this idea that it's like you want to overcompensate, you want to become so articulate, you want to study hard and work twice as hard as everybody else for acceptance. And then the day that you realize, which I think is what was leading me to not wanting to be an artist anymore, was I thought, you know, I'm working as hard as I possibly can, and it's just a continual rejection. And so at some point you just kind of let it go because you realize that they're not going to let you melt. People aren't going to let you melt. And I think there's probably a lot of subconscious tensions going on inside of all of us that we want to be nice to each other. We want to be polite. We want to have a harmonious world. But difference is real. Yeah. It's very, and I oftentimes think, you know, my body moving through the world has to be different than your body moving through the world. We have to look at things differently. I teach drawing, and one of the things we always teach is that, you know, when you're drawing from observation, you're looking at something, the minute you move, everything is shifted, and you're never going to come back to that exact same perspective. And so this awareness that, I mean, the most minute shift, like the whole thing changes, you know, everything is constantly in shift. So I think, I don't know, I think just sort of releasing all of that effort put towards trying to acclimate. Yeah. I just decided to just shift it towards, well, what do you want to see? And that's really where the artworks come from, was thinking it's like, what are the artworks that I wanted to see when I was 10? What are the artworks I want to see when I'm 60? Make them now.
Before we open it up for a couple of audience questions, Claudia, did you have other questions you wanted to pose to the artists?
Yeah, I think if you don't mind, if I could ask, so this issue about craft, I thought that both of you make use of craft very tactically. Can you talk about, do you think about craft in a particular way as a tool, as a kind of point of resistance or something else that you reach for in your work?
I think so, because I just answered the question. I think I answered the question in the presentation where I wanted to use embroidery because because it was a way for me to say, okay, women didn't invent painting, so I'm going to embroider to make painting with my embroidery. Mm-hmm. I actually don't even like embroidery.
Interesting.
It's true. I have to do it, but I don't like it.
Yeah.
I forget who was talking about categorize. Oh, I can't even say it.
Categorization.
There you go.
I can't say
That's
it
the
either.
word.
Yeah.
And how we name things. You know, we can talk about naming race. We can talk about naming species of plants. As much as growing up, I think many times I felt kind of narrowly pigeonholed into the term Native American. At the same time, I do understand it's the way that we navigate through the world. I mean, it's the way we're kind of mapping through space and the unknown. But those terms have to shift. As we learn more, those terms have to shift to accommodate kind of where we're at. I think for me, craft came at a point for me when I was so angry with the art world that the categorization of painting versus sculpture versus video versus performance, I also had to let all of those things fall apart. And it went back to what is the artwork that you want to see made? What is the content? What is the story you're trying to tell? Using the materials that I use, again, they completely reposition the viewer. One of the things that allowed me to go back to painting on canvas at this point is because I've done the beaded yellow triangle. So now I can paint a yellow triangle. And that comparison between the two means something.
Yeah.
And so it's not just the hybrid anymore of established formats or languages, but now it's authoring. Like that's sort of what came through the series of the bags is you generate a platform and a foundation to speak from. The hard part is knowing what do you want to author to say. And I agree with you about the text. When you're quoting somebody, it comes with a kind of popular culture authority that is so difficult to have as an individual.
But that is also part of the high art world, right?
Yes,
The use
absolutely.
of text, that's another reference. So anyway, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there any questions?
First, let me express my gratitude to the two artists, Ms. Amer and Mr. Gibson, for coming to speak to us. It was pleasurable and it was very edifying. And I do, talking about the different cultures, I do observe on the stage as I listen to you and your body language and everything, I do observe 4 distinctively different cultures. And to Ms. Amer in particular, I say, vive la différence. Okay, merci mille fois. You know, as having come to this museum many times, and I look at the architecture, and I observe the different influences in architecture, and I think about your background as being Egyptian, native Egyptian, and your French, but Egyptian background. I perceive a lot of Islamic influences in the architectural style of this museum. I was just wondering if you have observed that or if you have any perception of that, but I look at the angularity of the museum, the solid walls, the solidity, and to me, it's reminiscent of a lot of the Islamic influences that I've seen in Islamic architectural designs. Thank you very much. I'll be curious to get your thoughts.
I don't know because I arrived yesterday, so I haven't still seen the whole museum, but
So,
I don't know. I will answer to you maybe later when I visit.
Time for one last question.
Hi, my name is Ruth Lopez, and I just want to ask you, how do you think the art will evolve in the next century? And I will quote my grandpa question, that is, why the people don't like to paint anymore like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo? He used to ask me that a lot, and that's my question for you.
Well, I personally don't really like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo.
Yeah.
I mean, they're okay, but it's not, for me, it's not first they are men. And I don't know why this should be the reference. So and then I don't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
I wish I knew.
I mean, I know for me, you know, well, my education at least was learning to paint and draw representationally, and you know, you copy Michelangelo at one point. And for me, it became really problematic to actually use a loose illusionary tactics to represent something, which is really what painting is. You learn how to recreate atmosphere and light and shadow, and you're using paint to kind of trick in many ways to construct an image. And for me, I just wanted to remove all of that kind of hierarchy of craft and skill out of the work. And so I try to make work where a viewer can literally deconstruct what they're looking at, in terms of materials. They're really constructions, And I think in the future, I think the internet is going to change, or already has changed everything. I think we'll continue to kind of like break down these kind of formats and barriers of what exists. I think painting will always have a place in the art world, to be honest, because it's such a spectacular material that I think still has so many ways of being reinvented. And I think people will. Do you do all your own beadwork? Do I do my own beadwork? No, I used to, but for probably about 4 years now, I have a team of people who work with me in upstate New York. Yeah, not quite as intense as that, but yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so
Thank you.
much. Thank you.